Have we got people?
Is it possible that I?
Oh.
Yeah, because
Where is your slide? Here.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe you want to ask your audience if they can see the slides.
Yes, you can see
Yeah, they
the
can see
slideshow.
them.
Okay,
They're online.
but the people who are watching remotely, can you see the slide in slide mode? I hope you can. Yes.
Okay, great.
Ευχαριστώ.
Okay, thanks. So, good afternoon, everyone. And a very warm welcome to you all online and in person, and to our distinguished speaker, Professor Mark Janse from the University of Ghent, who is Emeritus Professor of Ancient and Asia Minor Greek. There, he's also an affiliated researcher at our faculty here in Cambridge. As part of the work that he's been doing on Greek in relation to the Cambridge Center for Greek Studies. We are also delighted to report that Professor Janse is, as of next week, or
sometime next
honorary consul for Greece in the Flemish region. So I think this is a huge honor, well, for him, but also for us Greeks, because he's keeping the research and the study of Greek, both historical and dialectal, synchronic and historical, alive, not only in Belgium and the Netherlands, but also internationally as well. So today he's going to talk to us about more work on two dialects that shed light on the historical language change that he has been working on in Greek and Cappadocian in particular. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yancy. I'm very happy to be back in Cambridge, especially in my new capacity as affiliated researcher, which is also, for me, a specific and very great honor. I will talk about Cappadocian. I think most of you won't be surprised that I've chosen this topic for my seminar at the Center for Greek Studies. And in particular, I would like to present two varieties that are still spoken in Greece. One that most of you already heard about, Mishotika. The other one, Axenitika, is very closely related to Mishotika. They form a subgroup, dialectal subgroup, very closely related, but they sound very differently. So the main differences are in the phonology. And I thought it would be nice just to present you some examples of the similarities and the differences between the two dialects. Also, for those of you who know more about ancient Greek, I think you will be interested in Cappadocian Greek, because it is a very archaic variety of Greek, as I will show you immediately. This, by the way, is a picture that was taken by Halliday, who was the companion of Richard Dawkins during his field trips to Cappadocia in 1909, 1910, 1911. Richard Dawkins, an Oxford professor, the other university. He's the great specialist, or he was the great specialist of Cappadocian Greek, wrote a beautiful book about it, Modern Greek in Asia Minor. We have these pictures that are kept in the archives of the British School in Athens. And this is one of them. This is between Cappadocia and the Farasha region, which is in the southwest of Cappadocia. You will be able to see it in the background. So for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you all know, this is Cappadocia. And this is a map of the Cappadocian dialects. You don't have to memorize them. It's just to give you an idea of the dialectal groupings. And you will see immediately this is the central group. And here is where the villages are located, where the two dialects that are still spoken in modern Greece originate from. So you see in the eastern part, you see Misti or Mishti, as it was called, and in the western part, Axos, and they, of course, gave their names to the varieties Axenitka and Mishotika. I just gave you the other groupings. The groupings that I like to group them this way. It's based mainly on Dawkins' work, but you have to understand that this is mainly a geographical subgrouping of the Cappadocian dialects, and one of them in particular, that is this dialect, Del Messo, is dialectologically, it's geographically southwest, but dialectologically it goes more with the northeastern groups. So you see that, you know, geographical groupings and dialectological groupings, they don't always go together. And this also holds for another dialect from a little village called Dila, which is actually a colony, so to speak, of Mishti. So the people there spoke a variety of Mishotica as well. The other two colonies, you can see them here. Troho goes with Axol, and Charikli goes with Mishti. This is just for your information. Don't worry if you forget about all these names. This is the groupings with the colors related to the geographical subgrouping. And there you have it. These are the only varieties of which we have information and of sorts. There must have been, of course, many more Greek-speaking communities, Cappadocian Greek-speaking communities, but by the time Dawkins did his fieldwork around 1910, he already reported that in some villages, Greek had disappeared just a decade before his visit. So it was a very rapid decline of the Greek-speaking Cappadocian Greek-speaking communities before, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and before the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in the 1920s. Okay, when we talk about two dialects still spoken, it suggests that other dialects are no longer spoken. This is to a great extent true. The only thing is that we don't know, or at least I don't know, there may be isolated speakers of some of the other dialects that I don't know about, but these are the only dialects I know of which are spoken to some extent within a certain community. And as we will see, Axenitica, the speakers, I would call them semi-speakers, which means that they usually communicate among themselves in modern Greek, and they can shift to Axenitica, but I don't know if they only do it when I'm present or if they also do it when I'm not there. It's very difficult, of course, to measure that. But when I said that we don't know exactly which dialects are still spoken, but for a long time, linguists and dialectologists believed that Cappadocian was a dead variety of Greek. None other than Nikolaos Kondosopoulos, the great modern Greek dialectologist, in his popular book on modern Greek dialects, wrote in the first edition, which was published in 1981, that he believed that there were no speakers left of Cappadocian Greek. As you can see in this excerpt, σήμερα δεν μιλούνται πια τα ιδιώματα αυτά, αφού όλοι σχεδόν οι φορείς τους πρόσφυγες του 1922 έχουν πεθάνει. So in 1980, say around 1980, most of the speakers had died, according to the information that Kondosopoulos had at his disposal. And this is also the information I had when I started working on Cappadocian, which is in the early 1990s, around 1992, when I stumbled across a text, transcribed text in Cappadocian, and I thought this is really something very interesting. I want to know more about this dialect. But it was a dead variety of Greek, which was not really a problem for me because I was working mainly on ancient Greek, which is also a dead variety. So I said, well, you know, another dead variety. I didn't mind about that. So if you would look up information about Cappadocian Greek, for instance, in the linguist list, which is a repository of information on the status of languages spoken worldwide, you would find, and you can see when this was retrieved in 2007, that Cappadocian Greek is first of all listed as a language, not as a dialect. And there are actually good reasons to consider a number of varieties of Greek as separate languages rather than dialects. It's a debated issue, of course, in Greece. But you can think, if you think about the modern Romance languages, there are very few people who would talk about them in terms of Latin dialects. And where is my presentation? It's gone. I don't know how to get rid of this. Ah, there it is. Sorry. That's what happens when you talk about extinct varieties, then all of a sudden all the information disappears altogether. Yes.
Does that work?
Yeah. And now we have to get rid of that again. Did you do that? There's a reason why I became a linguist. I'm not very technical, as you can see.
I think it happened because you said it's a language and not a dialect.
There was censorship. It was censorship. Okay.
I don't know.
Now we go back to the.
They can see it as a whole.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I hope everyone can see what the people here can see live in the audience. So it is considered an extinct language. And as I said, I believe Cappadocian can be considered a Hellenic language, like the South Italian varieties, Greco and Greco. Pontic Greek is, I'm pretty sure, a separate variety that is distinctive enough to be called a language, and probably, you know, other varieties as well. If we go to another slide, this is the ethnologue. I don't know if you're familiar with the ethnologue. The information on the linguist list is actually taken from the ethnologue. If you use it, be very careful, because when I say that Cappadocian is a language, you will find that there are many more varieties in the ethnologue that are called languages, which, you know, some of them are very debatable. In the Netherlands, for instance, I found a number of varieties which were called languages, which I cannot seriously consider to be separate languages. What is very peculiar here in the ethnologue, though, is that it's not just said that the language is extinct, but the whole population is extinct as well. It's as if when you stop speaking a language, it doesn't mean that the entire population dies immediately as a kind of punishment, of course, right? So the population is still there, and some of them don't speak Cappadocian Greek, and others still speak it to some extent. As you can see, here are some speakers. This is
sorry, Mark, we cannot see. We
cannot
cannot see
see.
the slides. We are still on the linguist list side.
Okay, let me see if I can try to remedy this. I can see only the people who are online.
We can see it now.
You can see it now?
Well, we see some people from Xirohori.
Yeah, that's very good, because but now I can't see them on my little screen here, so I will have to watch the big screen as well to see what I'm talking about. It's not very convenient, though. So you will see a number of speakers, original speakers. Unfortunately, some of them have died in the meantime, because the best speakers inevitably are the eldest speakers, and especially the eldest women were by far the best speakers. The men usually, they go out and sit in the cafenio and talk among themselves, and they speak Greek even among themselves, but also with other peoples present. And so their Cappadocian is much more, how shall we say, re-Hellenized as compared to the speech of the elder women who spend most of the time at home. And this is my favorite speaker. And this is, as you can see, he's alive and kicking and smoking. This is one of the, this was the oldest speaker of Axenitica I met in 22. And he's doing very well. Okay, this is just a list of sources, just to give you an idea. It doesn't say very much without the titles, I understand that. The yellow ones are publications by native speakers, by field workers. The blue ones are by native speakers. These four have written different dictionaries of Michotica. And then the yellow ones are those who did field work on the varieties. As you can see, my field work on Michotica started in 2006 and on Axenitica in 2014. Okay, why is Cappadocian Greek interesting? If you look at the history of the varieties spoken in the eastern part of Asia Minor, which are generally referred to as Asia Minor Greek. It's a very common denominator you will find also in general linguistic, in the general linguistic literature. If you read Asia Minor Greek, it usually refers to just Pontic and Cappadocian, not to any variety spoken or one spoken in Asia Minor. But if you see, it goes back to the Koine variety and a very special subvariety. We know from work on specialists on Koine Greek like Tung and others that there were different varieties of Koine Greek. And one of the varieties is the Eastern Koine, which comprised Asia Minor, the Middle East, let's say Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And then within this Eastern Koine, there was an Anatolian or Asia Minor Koine. And then the Eastern part developed probably very early on as a separate unit called East Asia Minor Greek. And the best known representatives are Pontic and Cappadocian, and another one, Pharisot. You know Pharisot because one of my PhD students did a doctorate on Pharisot Greek. So you can see that it really goes back to the Hellenistic period. And then there is another interesting thing about these varieties of Greek. If you think about Eastern or Central Asia Minor, you will probably know that at one time in the second millennium, this was Hittite territory. This was the Hittite Empire, where Anatolian languages were spoken. Hittite disappeared early on, but Luvian was the spoken variety for a very long time, probably even well into the first millennium. So there is the possibility of an Anatolian substrate, especially in Cappadocian. There are some indications, but it's very difficult to prove that they are really Anatolian. But there are definitely also indications of an Ionic substrate. And the Ionic substrate goes back, especially in Pontic, of course, to the colonization of the northern coast of Asia Minor in the 7th, 6th century, especially by Miletus, which was an Ionic city, which brought the Ionic dialect to the shores, the northern shores, the southern shores of the Black Sea, and probably from the harbors into Cappadocia. There are some indications. We know there was trade, and there are indications that there were kind of, colonies in Cappadocia where the Ionic variety spoken in the Pontic area must have been used as one of the languages of communication. And there are indications of this Ionic substrate also in Cappadocian. Okay, so why is it interesting? It's a very archaic peripheral dialect together with Pontic. It was isolated from the rest of the Greek-speaking world after the Battle of Manzikert in 1076. So there is almost no contact between Cappadocia and the rest of the Greek-speaking world. And also, when we go to the 19th century, you can see that when there was a new interest in these remote areas of Asia Minor from Constantinople, that in some villages, schools were established, but only in very few. So this means that the local varieties in most of these villages where we have information about, they were not, say, polluted by any other variety of Greek, and they developed, so to speak, in splendid isolation for a very, very long time. So it's interesting for historical linguists to see how Greek developed in this particular area. I've used Cappadocian for my students, even for students who didn't know any Greek, because there's so much variation, and you can actually test a number of sound changes by looking at the way they develop in the different dialects, because they go, any which way. It's been a very hot topic in contact linguistics since the book by Thomason and Kaufman, published in 1988, where Asian Minor Greek was the first case study in their book, in which they showed that genetic classification sometimes doesn't work if language contact comes into play, especially in the case of Creoles, but there are many languages where you have a long period of intensive language contact, where a language develops into a variety which typologically and perhaps also genetically doesn't go back to one parent language, but maybe to just two parent languages from different language families. And in the case of Cappadocia, especially in the dialects where the influence of Turkish was very, very heavy, you can ask yourself whether, if we didn't have any information about Greek and just had the data from those dialects, and we had to go on comparing those dialects to Greek on the one hand and Turkish on the other hand, it will be very difficult to actually prove which was the parent language and which was the donor language at some point. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this. Let's say a few words about the social linguistic profile of those dialects. I met the first speakers of Mishiotica Cappadocian in 2005, which was at the time a huge surprise for me, because I was working on the assumption that it was a dead language. And then it turned out that at least in 3 villages, there was a community in which it was still used to some extent, although, of course, it was used for specific purposes, not for communication to the outside world, obviously not. There's also the phenomenon of the diaspora. There are descendants of the refugees from this village who settled, they settled everywhere in Greece, in Athens, Piraeus. There are very many on the islands. In Crete, there are, etc., etc. The northern part of Greece, Macedonia, Thrace, there are very, very many Cappadocians who settled there, but there are no comparable situations, no villages or towns where Cappadocian Greek Mishiotica is used to the extent it is used in the villages of Mandra, Neo-Aioneri, and Xirochori. Now, for Axenitica, I had my first meeting with a native speaker in 2014 in Crete, when I was doing fieldwork in Crete and was invited to meet some people who were, originally from Misti, and they presented to me a person who they called the last speaker of Axenitica in Crete. And he said, there's no one to speak to talk to. So what he does, he still does, he writes stories and poetry in Axenitica, but he also says that, I don't speak a pure variety anymore, because we've been living in Crete for such a long time that our variety has been Creticized. And I will show you an example of this, because it's really very interesting. It's a very, common thing when a dialect is transplanted to another place and it comes into contact with dialects of the same language, but different dialects, then of course you get dialect contact, and this has certain effects as well. So these are the Mishiotica concentrations, and these are the Axenitica concentrations. So this is Axo Yanitson in the north, and here in the south of Crete, there is the village where my Axenitica informant was born and still lives. The information, the social linguistic information, it's difficult to give precise information. For instance, the number of speakers. In a couple of years ago, we did a survey, and we arrived at an estimated number of speakers of around 2,400. That was 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. It must have decreased by now, because many of the people who were then still fluent speakers have died, unfortunately. So my estimate, but it's a bit of a a wild guess, is 2,000. Most of these speakers are semi-speakers because they don't use it on a very regular basis. They use it in very specific circumstances when there are no strangers, and strangers can be any Greek who was not a native Cappadocian. So there are the occasions on which Cappadocian is used are decreasing, almost every year. My estimate is there's still 5% of native speakers, but again, I can't be too sure about that. The number of passive speakers, because if you count the number of speakers, many people will say, oh yes, I speak Cappadocian. And then when you try to find out how well they speak it, some people just know words or expressions, or when they speak it, it's more like Greek with a number of Cappadocian words in it, rather than Cappadocian with a number of Greek words or constructions, because that happens, of course, all the time. Even fluent speakers, if they are in contact with modern Greek almost on a daily basis, they will import Greek constructions, especially Greek words like katalaves, for instance. Katalaves, you hear it all the time when people speak Cappadocia. So if they say katalaves, I say anglaitja. And they start laughing because I use the Cappadocian word and they use the Greek words. I don't know if they don't use, I never hear them use the Cappadocian word in the sense that you katalaves as a discourse marker, that is. If you look at the age groups, there are still quite a few speakers who are in their 40s. And perhaps not surprisingly, this group is very active in trying to maintain the language. This is the generation who is very much aware of the fact that their language is dying. And they, more so than their parents and grandparents, try to keep it alive. And of course, this goes for some people, and other people, they couldn't be bothered. Gender, 50-50 for Michotica. If you look at Axenitica, very few speakers, but I would say most of them are semi-speakers. Some of them are quite fluent as far as I can judge. Many of them admit themselves that they're not fluent. So it's a difficult, and it's not, we should do a more thorough survey on that. Age group, 60 plus. Gender, I have heard 1 or 2 women, but I have reports that there are more women who can speak it quite well, and I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, so what is the main difference between Axenitica and Michotica? Well, if you look at the simple word ke, it is ke in Axenitica, which makes Axenitica a little bit more accessible if you know Greek than Michotica, because Michotica has both vowel raising, so unstressed e becomes I and unstressed o becomes u, as in Northern Greek, but it also has palatalization. So ke becomes chi. Well, I mean, there are other dialects where you have palatalization and vowel raising, so in itself, it's not a very peculiar thing. The only thing is that the vowel raising is found in 3 Cappadocian dialects, which belong to different groups. There's one northwestern dialect, there is one central dialect, Michotica, and there is one southeastern dialect where you find the vowel raising. So that is let's say, a north-south isogloss, whereas the other groupings, it cuts across the other groupings. So it's interesting in itself. Palatalization is only found in Michotica, and Dawkins reports it as something recent. So let's say around the beginning of the 20th century. Where it comes from, we don't know. Why it happened, we also don't know. We just see it happening, and nowadays they all do it. For instance, if they refer to Thessaloniki, they will use the Turkish name Selanik, but they will pronounce it Selanic. Okay, so they do it even but in this particular case. Now, the Cretan variety of this is Che. This is Axenitica, but with a Southern Cretan palatalization. That's a Southern Cretan phenomenon. So you hear Che instead of Ke, which makes it sound a little bit more like Michotica, but that's simply because of the contact with the Cretan variety spoken in the south. Okay, this is what Pavlidis calls Kritopoyithike to idioma mas. Okay, let's have. I thought it would be nice to present some examples, and I hope you recognize most of them. I added the Greek versions as well in the Greek alphabet, so you can make more sense of it. This is sometimes a bit hard to decipher. So this is the verb which, of course, means to lie in all the varieties of Greek, but in Axenitica and Michotica, it's the verb to be. And you can use it in an existential sense, but also, you know, as a kind of alternative to ime. And you see, this is the Axenitica version, kima, kisa, etc., etc. You see a few oddities if you compare it to modern Greek, but if you know your medieval Greek grammar well, you will find, and I'm looking at David in particular, you will find a lot of medieval Greek features in those dialects as well. Okay, this is the Michotica version. You see, it looks a little bit similar in the Greek transcription, but if you look at it this way, it's okay. You see, kime becomes chimi, etc. Kimeste, chimisti, etc. So it sounds really very different. This is really a problem if you make recordings and you listen to spoken Michotica, and it's just one continuous, you know, sound stream, and people, if they trust you, they don't speak very slowly. They will just rant on. So sometimes you don't even know where one word stops and the other one begins, etc., etc. And then with these palatalizations and vowel raisings, it takes sometimes a very long time if you don't have a native speaker sitting next to you to explain what the meaning of all this is or to separate the words. Then it can be, you know, quite a daunting puzzle to decipher the spoken Michotica. Just a few things that are interesting for linguists. If you look at this particular form, you see I write the ste becomes sti, but it's not sti in Michotica, it's ti. It's a geminate stop. So if you write it phonetically, it would be something like this. So it's a geminate stop. Michotica has geminate consonants. Some of them are the result of syncope, where an unstressed vowel is deleted and two identical consonants actually collide as a result of them. You can get a geminate consonant, but there are also spontaneous geminations, and this is a very peculiar one because it looks as if the S has somehow been assimilated or disappeared and compensated for by a gemination of this stop, the dental stop. This is the imperfect form. This is already a little bit strange if you only know modern Greek or ancient Greek. In medieval Greek, David, you can see where it comes from, obviously. So it's kyoton, me, kyoton, se, kyoton, etc. This is a very strange inflection, by the way. I will have more to say about this inflection tomorrow in my talk at the Faculty of Classics, because this is actually an agglutinative inflection, which is modeled on the Greek inflection. I won't say anything about this because that will be a spoiler for my talk that we give tomorrow. This is the Mishotika. Well, that sounds, again, very different, okay? So you see the vowel raising. You also see that there is voicing of the unvoiced dental stop to the. That is, of course, a very common phenomenon. I just come back from Spain, where they do it all the time. I speak Italian, but my Spanish is not very good. But you see that where Italian has an unvoiced stop in intervocalic position, it becomes a voice stop, and even, and this is what you hear in Mishotika as well, a fricative. That's a very common phenomenon as well, a sound change, a voiceless stop in intervocalic position becomes voiced, and then it becomes fricativized. And then what happens to fricatives, because they are very weak, they disappear. And so you can hear all of these varieties in Mishotika. Chodun, chodun mi, chodun, chon. Okay, so it all happens at the same time. And sometimes speakers use the different varieties next to one another. It's interesting because Mishotika speakers have discussions about this phenomenon, because if you look at this variety, you see there's a fricative, a voiced dental fricative here. And the inherited dental fricatives, both unvoiced th and the, are no longer, have disappeared in both Axenitica and Mishotika. That's a story in itself. So then, for instance, is then with a stop instead of a fricative. So when Mishotika speakers say we don't have the delta anymore, they say, but you say chodun. No, we don't say it. And then you get the discussions of people who just said it, and then they say, no, we don't have this delta, so it's impossible that I said it. So if I recorded it, I can make them listen to it. I said, here, you said it. That's strange, they say. So sometimes speakers are even unaware of what they are saying and why they are saying. And this is probably because you hear all this variation, Brahma, Brahmada, you hear Brahmada, Brahmada, Brahma, again, the same sound change. So there is a secondary fricative, voice fricative, that is the result of a number of sound changes. Okay, let's see what else we can talk about. As in Northern Greek, Cappadocian is characterized by the deletion of unstressed I and unstressed U, especially in final position, but also in medial position. In final position, it has, as one of the results is that if you look at the inflection of inherited O stems like anthropos, you will see that the genitive is in Mishotika, for instance, it's aropus with vowel raising. The genitive is arop from aropu, but the unstressed U is deleted, so you get arop. The nominative is aropi originally. Unstressed E gets deleted, and so the nominative plural is arop, which is identical with the genitive singular. Okay, so this is nothing, unusual in itself. Syncretism happens in, suppose most languages, but this is a consequence of this deletion of unstressed vowels, and as a consequence, some of the inflections have, syncretic forms. You can see it here. Grevi becomes grev, or kref with unvoicing at the end. But you see that it's not always effective, this deletion of unstressed E. So you have in the first person plural, you have grevum, and not grevme or something like that, as in the third person singular, where you have grevne from grevune. There the U is deleted or syncopated, but not in the first person plural. Grevit, in the second person plural, you don't have grefte or kreft or something like that. It's always grevit. Okay, these are the Greek forms. These are the reconstructed forms because krevo comes from yirevo. Okay, it means to want, to desire. Krevo in Cappadocia means to desire. Krevisto, you want it. It's from yirevo, so you see that the E in yirevo is also deleted, unstressed E, and then the result is that you get a form like krevo. Okay, Misiotica, you have the vowel raising, and now we have a possible explanation. In Misiotica, you would have an explanation for the fact that the U is deleted in the third person's plural, but not in the first person, in the first person plural, it is not, and in the third person plural, it is deleted. If we derive it from yirev vome with an O, we can explain it as raising, which might be a reason why it didn't get syncopated. The same with yirevete. By vowel raising, this becomes yirevit. And so this E is not deleted because it is a secondary E and not a primary E. But why do we have it in Actinitica, where we don't have vowel raising? Okay, so that's a question in itself. Okay, I mean, this is what happens when you look very closely at any variety of Greek. There's always surprises and always food for thought, and you want to solve these, and sometimes it just isn't very easy to solve them. Okay, so here we have the forms, and that was the verb I want. Now some variation. If you look at these two verbs, fero, modern Greek, it's ferno, right? So here we have the older forms, fero and misiotica. Look at the imperfect form. This is a very peculiar formation of the imperfect, which you find in some varieties of Pontic, but it's very common in Cappadocian Greek. You have an imperfect formation with the suffix ishk. And ishk is, it's a very intriguing suffix because you find it in Hittite, where it is used in some context where you might compare it with imperfective aspects in verbs. It's not exactly the same as the Greek imperfect, but there are similarities. Is this an Anatolian survival? That's very, very unlikely because Hittite ceased to be spoken, as far as we can tell, already well into the second millennium. That is before Greek made its appearance in Cappadocia and even in Pontus, right? Because that is only the 7th century. In Luwian, it has changed to tsa. Shke has become tsa. So you cannot connect Luwian with this ishk. And so this is an intriguing intriguing thing. You only find it in the imperfect. It's not in the present, right? So it's not a thing that is connected with imperfective stems versus perfective stems, which you find here. It's specifically used in the imperfect. And then you see the variation in Actinitica. This is Dawkins, and this is one of the native speakers who wrote a grammar of Actinitica. They only report this form, where you can see that the unstressed E is syncopated. So instead of ferishka, you have feshka, okay? In my fieldwork, speakers who were very fluent in Actinitica, they would use fershka, but also ferishka. So the unsyncopated form, well, this is of course the form that underlies this form. So it's no surprise that it was not reported by Dawkins, but it's very likely that it had been used side by side with the syncopated form. You also hear fernishka. Now, fernishka has the fern is from ferno, that is interference from modern Greek, because we have no trace of ferno, of fern as an imperfective stem in Cappadocian. And also this is reported already by Mavrochalividis, eferna, which is like the regular imperfect, without using this ishk suffix. The aorist is always ifera, not efera, but ifera with the other augment. You find this in all kinds of verbs, peno, penishka, peshka, penishka, etc. aorist pira, and here pia, of course, with the fricative deleted in the vocalic position. So, and you can, I mean, you can go on and on, but I decided to give you an example of a verb which you probably don't know unless you read the article that I wrote about it, because I haven't seen this verb anywhere else except in Cappadocian. If anyone knows about this verb outside of Cappadocia, you can tell me now. It's perpenu, and if you look at the Greek, you can see that it is actually derived from pero, to take, and peno, to go, and it literally means to take someone somewhere, okay? So it's a transitive verb, but it's very strange. If you look at the inflection, perpenishka is the imperfect, but look at the aorist. I haven't found it in Mishiotica, so these forms are reconstructed on the basis of other Cappadocian dialects, but if you look at them, you see that the vowel in the stem changes. In the aorist, it's pira, and in the subjunctive, it's parpao. So it looks as if, so this is normal. This part is normal, penishka, penu, pao, pira, etc. But this first element, that is very strange because the vowel changes by analogy with, the change in this stem, but there is no ending. And this is an example. I cannot give you all the details, but this is an example that I described in detail in the Transactions of the Phonological Society. This is really a Turkish phenomenon. It's called suspended affixation. So the affix or the suffix in this verb is suspended, and it appears only here. So you get a kind of verbal compound, which is unlike any other verbal compound in Greek, because if you have a verbal compound in Greek, the first element doesn't change, the stem doesn't change. It's only the second element that changes benovieno, benovika. You don't say bikavika or bikovika or something like that. So the first element stays the same, and here it changes. And so this is a very un-Greek phenomenon, but it's a Turkish phenomenon. The strange thing is that I only have one example and another which is even more exotic, so I won't bother you with this. But you will agree with me that this is really an interesting and at the same time strange phenomenon. Then look at the imperfects. I thought I should throw in some imperfect forms of the type arapo and lalo, where of course in modern Greek you have different formations, arapusa and arapara, etc., etc. In Cappadocian, you find two types which are well known from medieval Greek. You have arabana, Mishiotica arabana, and as I was looking at this form some time ago, it dawned on me that this is really an interesting form if you come to think about it, because araban, this suffix, is the result of the third person singular, right, of the imperfect. Araba, araba is a third from arabae. The N at the end is a normal, you can have an N at the end of the third person singular, but apparently it was reanalyzed as a stem, and then you have the endings of the first person singular and the second, etc., attached to was originally already an ending in itself. This is a phenomenon that Brian Joseph has described for another example in modern Greek, and which I will use tomorrow in my talk about this strange imperfect kyoton me, where you have a third person singular kyoton, which is the Greek third person singular, but with the personal endings me, se, added to the third person singular. This is exactly what happened here as well. This is third person singular ending, and then reanalyzed as a stem, so you can add the personal suffixes to that as well. The aorist is, of course, with a syncope again. You have a different formation in the verb like lalo, to speak. lalina, you can see in Meshotica, it's not syncopated, so it's lalina. That is the same phenomenon. Lalina is from la, le, lalin is the third person singular, and then again with the personal endings added to this reanalyzed stem. So this is something that needs to be added to our dossier of Watkins law phenomena. And the aorist, you see that there is palatalization in Meshotica. You have lalsa. There is an epenthetic t, dental stop. So it's lalsa, but it's palatalized on the analogy of the third person singular. So lalchis, lalchin, and the ch is generalized across the paradigm. So you have this ch in the entire paradigm that goes for all aorist where there is syncope, and you have a cluster of consonants, and you have this sh or ch instead of s. I'm almost there. I told you about the strange thing that happened to the dental fricatives. So the theta, the th, the unvoiced dental fricative, and the voiced dental fricative, they have disappeared in all the Cappadocian dialects except the northern dialects. That you still find all the inherited dental fricatives, both voiced and unvoiced, but in the other dialects, they have been substituted. So you find all kinds of, well, not all kinds. Basically, what happens is that if a dental fricative is difficult to pronounce for some reasons, and some of the reasons, or one of these reasons could be that Turkish doesn't have dental fricatives and that they have been substituted with other stops. And what usually happens is you find either a consonant which has more or less the same place of articulation or more or less the same manner of articulation. I'm Dutch, so I can say that some of my compatriots have difficulty in pronouncing English. We're not alone. There are other people in the world who have difficulties in pronouncing the and th. But in Dutch English, it's very common to hear someone say, I think, or I think. Okay, so in one case you have a fricative, s. In the other case you have the same or more or less the same place of articulation, but a different manner. So you have a stop instead of a fricative. There are some jokes that I cannot tell you now about Germans who have this peculiarity of pronouncing English, but I can tell this on another occasion over drinks. It also happens in Cappadocian Greek, and basically the most common change, and I would think that this is actually the regular sound change, is that the manner of pronunciation is maintained, but the place of articulation is different. So instead of a dental fricative, you either have a palatal fricative, voiceless fricative, or a velar voiceless fricative. So theko, which is a variant. David, have you found this in medieval Greek? Theko. I couldn't find it in Kriaras, but I'm sure I mean, this is, sometimes you can use Cappadocian to reconstruct at least one variety of medieval Greek, namely the Eastern Anatolian variety. If you find a form that is not found anywhere else, sometimes you have to reconstruct it. But I trust David, of course, that it was found elsewhere. This is based, it's a reanalyzed present stem on the basis of the aorist, right? Ethica, etc. So this is why you have theko. It becomes gecko in Axenitica, gecko in Meshotica with the vowel raising. But now, if you look, already Mavro Halividis, who was a native speaker, but who wrote well after the population exchange, he notes gekno with the nasal as a variant in addition to gecko. This is probably due to modern Greek interference, where you have thekno, and then you get this gekno, but also thekno, which is, of course, well, it is a combination of different present formations. This is the imperfect, which you already know, And here you have the aorist. I don't think I need to say very much about that. So this is the normal change where a dental fricative becomes a palatal or a velar fricative. The word for God, you would think that in a very, devout area as Cappadocia, Cappadocians tell me they have more saints than any of the other Greeks. It's probably true. That they should pronounce the word for God differently. I mean, you would think about even in church, they would talk about Otheos, etc., etc. No. In Axelitica, it's Theos. There is of course, no original inherited fricative, but there is this strange phenomenon that whereas fricatives are very vulnerable in intervocalic position, and as a result, they are deleted very easily, as you have seen in many of the examples that I've discussed. When you arrive at two vowels in contact, that is in a hiatus situation, this hiatus is very often resolved by, yes, a fricative. So they disappear and then sometimes they reappear, but this is not an original fricative, of course. This is just one way of resolving the hiatus in the name of God. This is the Greek version, of course, but you also have theros in contemporary speakers of Axelitica. But the nicest part is, of course, in Michotica, where you can refer to God as Hios, Hieros, 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 Theos, Theros, Soros as well. And everybody knows who you're talking about. Okay, so we should write this with a capital letter because it's all God. The only way you can't talk about God is by referring to him as Theos, which is remarkable, isn't it? This is just to show you that there are a number of non-Greek kinship terms in Cappadocian, and some of them can be actually identified. Dayı in Turkish is an uncle, it's mother's brother. In Michotica, if you don't know that it's from dayı, it's day, so it doesn't really sound like the Turkish word. Also probably because there are local Turkish varieties we know not enough about. Cappadocian, many different sub-dialects of Turkish. The father's brother is Luva. I'm looking at Jeffrey in particular. If you have any idea where Luva comes from, it's the uncle on the father's side. It's very common. Okay, so even, and this is actually remarkable because some of these kinship terms as Luva, Dei, Ija, this is a word to refer to an elder relative, but specifically in Michotica to the aunt on the father's side, Ija, but it's actually a kind of honorific term to refer to elder female relatives. These foreign kinship terms, even though they could have been substituted with the Greek equivalents because they are so long, they have been in Greece for such a long time now, they are still used very, very often. And you can imagine why, because they are the kinds of words that are used frequently in everyday conversations. And so these are the words that I think will stick the longest, even if Cappadocian dialects have disappeared altogether, they will probably still have these words. And I'm thinking especially of the word for grandmother, which is kaka, not kaka, because kaka means the same as anywhere else. It's kaka, which means grandmother. And I think as long as the grandmothers are still alive that have been referred to as kaka and not as yaya, the word will remain. And when the next generation, maybe they will keep it. Maybe they say, you have to call me kaka instead of yaya. Okay. Those of you who were there last year, because I have some recordings, but I didn't put them in the PowerPoint, so it may take some time to find them. But maybe you might as well listen to me trying to pretend that I'm a speaker of Aksenitka and a speaker of Mishotika at the same time. I'm sure there's no one in the audience who will be able to correct me, so I feel rather safe about this. So, Ishi Taksenitka la listami. Just try to make sense of it, okay? I will just read it. Erod denda la lokala, ama angnadizuta lirushko. Yavash machenuta. Takakayes ketanekas, astulunu kala la lunda. Panokato, you understand some of it? Okay, Mishotika, it's I should have started with the Mishotika, okay? So, Ishida Mishotka Gyalajevistami, Oro Denda Gyalajevu Kala, Ama Anglaizu da Lichko, Hirama Enuda, Takakaisti da Nechis, Icha ab Ula Kala Gyalajevnida. Do I have an English, sorry, no? No. Let me just go back. Screens, no, that is not good. Yes. We are at the end, so don't worry. It's I'm almost done. So I hope we'll get back to the original slide. It's extinct. No, it's one push away from extinction. Okay, let's see. This is, I don't have the Greek version, or did I? Yes, no. Okay, so you will understand some of it, of course, because it has the verb lalo in it, which means obviously to speak. So ishi is you, esi. Aksenitka, do you speak it? Me is a Turkish interrogative particle, which is still used. I mean, the good speakers still use it. So you just add it at the end. It's a clitic, it's an enclitic, and you can add it, even if the intonation signals that it's a question, you use this particle. So in Mishotika, it's ishi, ta Mishotka Gyalajevis tami. You can see little differences. Ero denda la lo kala. I don't speak it well. Oro denda gyalajevu. Gyalajevu is an old Turkish. It's an old Ottoman Turkish word for to speak. So they use another verb for to speak. I don't speak it well. Ama, this is Aksenitika. Ama is Turkish, but Allah. Angnadizo, anglamak means to understand in Turkish. So this is a Turkish verb. Cappadocian is full of Turkish verbs that have been borrowed. So the myth that verbs are very difficult to borrow in language contact is disproven by Cappadocian and by other languages, by the way. But I don't understand. I understand it lirushko a little bit. Okay. Ama anglaizuda lichko, lichiku. A little bit. Yavash, that's Turkish. Hira, sigar, I'm slowly. Machenota, I'm learning it. Hira, maenoda, okay, it's a little different. The fricative has disappeared. Takakayes, ketanekes, the grandmothers and the women. Dakakayes chidanechis, palatalization and vowel raising all over the place. Astulunu kala, this is a superlative, the best of all. Dalalun, they speak it the best of all. Okay. Icha, they, ab ula kala dagyalajevni, it's the same, they speak it the best. So actually it's the women who are the guardians of the Cappadocian dialects, as in many other cases. They are the ones who have preserved the dialects the best, especially the elder ones, but also some of the younger generation. I find that there are more women than men who are very eager to keep or try to keep that dialect alive and save it at least for some time to come. Thank you very much. Have you enjoyed it? Too much information.
Thank you very much. This wonderful. Are there any questions from here or from the online? Maybe you need to.
Maybe I should.
Oh, there is a question online while you're thinking about the question. So, Elena, can you please unmute? I don't know if we can hear you well.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor, for a very fascinating talk. I come to this as an amateur, so unfortunately, a lot of the linguistic analysis was lost on me. But what was very apparent, though, was just how different these two dialects are. And my question is, how can we explain this phenomenon that within a relatively contained geographical region, there are such varieties? I mean, didn't these communities interact with one another in order to create a more homogenized or unified dialect? I'd be quite interested in some reason for explaining so much variety. And you only gave us two. I mean, at the beginning of the talk, it was clear that there were many more.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for the question. I can tell by your family name that you must have some Asia Minor roots as well.
Yes, that's correct. Hence the interest, the amateur interest. But I speak no Cappadocian, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So your question is a very good one, of course. Sometimes if you look at variation, and I mean, a lot of variation, I'm thinking of Papua New Guinea, where most of the languages of the world are concentrated on a relatively, well, it's a big island, but still it's amazing that some 800, maybe 850 languages are spoken there. But if you look at the landscape, you can understand why, because it's a very rugged, mountainous island where it's sometimes very difficult to get from one community to the other, etc., etc. In the case of Cappadocia, there was, of course, I mean, there were contacts between the different villages, although the contacts were mostly by men who would travel around to do business, to sell, some kind of products or whatever. There were also intermarriages, and there are also, other, there were people who moved from one village to another, it is very difficult to trace these movements because we only have so much, actually, we have so few texts left. Dawkins only has folktales. So a folktale is, of course, a very, peculiar representation of a dialect. We don't have ordinary conversations in any of those dialects. We only have traditional songs, folktales, and it's only in later periods that we have actually, people who tell real life stories, for instance, how they moved from their village during the population exchange. And nowadays, when we have such recordings, we are actually recording people who have been living here for such a long time that their dialect has been influenced by local Greek varieties, etc. So coming back to the Cappadocian situation, it is true that of the dialects we have, there are only like a dozen or 14 actually, that the differences between these dialects are very impressive. And one of the reasons is obviously that there was no standard language. There was no standard Cappadocian, which was taught in schools. In most of the villages, there weren't even schools. So the people were actually using a very local variety. And because what I told you about the women being the guardians of the Cappadocian dialects, this was also the case in Cappadocia. There were actually villages for which Dawkins describes the sociolinguistic situation as follows. The men only speak Turkish, and the women speak the dialect among themselves, and they also use it with their children. If they stop using it with the children, you know that the dialect is going to die within, the next generation or even sooner. So in many of these villages, especially in the southeast, the men who were the most mobile of the speakers, they had to know Turkish, obviously, and they would also use it among themselves, which is one of the reasons why even in villages where the population was entirely or largely Christian, Mishti, for instance, was an entirely Christian village. And still the people, this is reported by Dawkins, for some reason, they still use Turkish a lot, okay? So even in churches, we have reports that in the churches that there were bishops who would explain as they were reading the Gospels or singing the Psalms, that obviously the people who spoke Cappadocian, they could not understand biblical Greek anymore, so it had to be explained. And we know, for instance, that in one village there is a report that the bishop explained, it was a bishop, mind you, who explained the meaning of the Greek texts that were used or actually read or sung in the church in Turkish. Okay, so Turkish was really a very important factor in everyday life as well, which means that the dialects were probably used in more restricted circles. And that is, of course, one possible explanation for the fact that the difference between the local varieties were so significant. It doesn't explain all of it, but I think that this is at least a partial explanation. And then, of course, the lack of schooling and the standard language.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Follow from what Alina asked, would you not agree with my interpretation is a question of identity as well. So I speak in Mediterranean language, and there's variation in dialect from one village to another, where my father's from. So it's a question of identity. You are of that village, you speak. It's a question of identity. There's an emotive association with that identity, which explains variations.
Yeah, that's a very good point, of course. I'm from a region in the Netherlands where we have the same problem, so to speak. If I go to Amsterdam, people will immediately hear that I'm from the south, and they will assume that I speak Belgian, as they call it. So it's not a language, but I think that this is it's a very good point. Also, because people would not refer to their dialect as Cappadocian. Cappadocian is something that they heard about when they came to Greece. You speak Axenitica from Axo. You speak Mishotica from Mishti. So you refer to your local dialect by referring to the name. It's an adjective which refers to the name of the village. So that is another indication that identity plays a role. And how far identity really was important as it is nowadays, that is very difficult to judge, because we simply don't have this kind of information for the period we are referring to, the end of the Ottoman Empire. And the people, Dawkins was already interested in, he was very much interested in what we would call today sociolinguistic facts. But the identity thing, I don't know if they really felt the need to distinguish them, especially because in villages where the men just spoke Turkish and the women they were not mobile, then this need for expressing your identity was, of course, not as felt as in other villages where there was also the men who would speak the dialect. But there must be at least some. I take the point. It's a very good one, especially because some of the dialects which are very closely related but are very different phonologically, because it's not just in this case, but there are two other dialects which are, you could say it's the same dialect, but it has vowel raising, which makes it sound, different. They must have kept their differences to distinguish themselves as belonging to this community or that community. Thank you. That was a very good point.
There is a question online, but I think they have a question as well.
Thank you. I've got a different question, but if I could just pursue that same argument a little bit further. You talked about intermarriages between villages. Now, if it's the case that it's the man who moves to the wife's village, that would also help to preserve the language, that particular form of the dialect, because the anthropologists have a word for it, don't they? Auxiliary local or something like that. It's the woman who is the bearer of language. So if the man moves, the woman stays put in her own village. That would help the preservation of the local dialect.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But a different question about vowel raising, which also occurs, of course, in the language today, in the northern dialects, Macedonian, and so on. Now, the fact that it happens in Visigothica and it happens in northern dialects of mainland people, does that mean that that sound change took place before the split in the 11th century? Can we therefore date vowel raising in northern dialects of Greek to pre-11th century?
Yes, well, that's of course a very intriguing question. It's one of the reasons, first of all, the phonology of Cappadocian shares a number of similarities with Northern Greek, which is why in early classifications it was grouped with the Northern Greek dialects. But Dawkins already said that it was very unlikely that there was a kind of continuum extending into Cappadocia, and that it was a phenomenon because, I mean, it can happen, and it happens, you know, in very different languages, very different places. The vowel raising is also difficult because, as I told you, this it happens in Malakopi, which is a northern dialect at Mishti, and in Semendri. Semendri and Mishti are relatively close, but there are no indications. I mean, it's an isogloss, but it's very difficult to say more than that, because we don't have evidence before the 19th century. So we cannot possibly trace the evolution of vowel raising in Cappadocian. We can trace the evolution of the deletion of unstressed E and U, because we have some older evidence for this. But unfortunately, unlike Pontic, Cappadocian, we only have very recent information, and especially the 19th century information, which was written up by local, usually people with some kind of education, priests or teachers, and who wanted to record the dialect, but they recorded it in the Greek alphabet, which is of course not suited to represent a number of the peculiar sounds, especially not the Turkish sounds, all the affricates, sorry, the palatals, the ch, the j, etc., etc. So sometimes we have to guess as to, in one particular dialect, they had this sound or they didn't have it, or this vowel or they didn't have it. So I cannot really answer the question as much as I would like to, and as much as I would like to have more information on the evolution of Greek in this particular area. Yes. Yes.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Julia Grigoruchko, good evening to everyone. Two minor questions. First, was the variety of Actinitica and Misiotica which you have heard significantly different from the variety which was described in Mavrokhaliditis Kisisoglu, or was it the same? What was your impression about the relative qualities of those of this material?
Well, I was surprised to hear so many similarities. Because some of the examples I gave of interference from modern Greek, they are, I mean, if you still use the imperfect in ishk, that is more significant, I would say, than if you would hear a form like eferna or whatever, which is simply more Greek. So yes, and this also, for Misiotica, it's different, because for Misiotica, Dawkins only has very, very limited information. He only has one particular folktale. This folktale has sometimes he says that in this particular folktale, the palatalization is partial. So sometimes it is applied, sometimes it's not applied. So it's very difficult to judge. Is this someone who was maybe not a native speaker of Mishotika, or what was it? Okay, so the differences between Mishotika as described by Dawkins and the Mishotika which is spoken nowadays are more substantial than the variety that was described for Axenitica by Mavrochalividis. That is certainly the case. There is also for Mishotika, there is an ethnographic study by Kostakis. Kostakis was, of course, you know him. He was a very well-known dialectologist, ethnologist who wrote several books about Cappadocian villages, an ethnographic study. And he has a number of transcriptions which are very strange. And I checked them with numerous native speakers, and especially the ones that struck me as being very strange or rare. I couldn't find any confirmation from any of the native speakers I talked to. So that suggests that his transcription, probably, of course, he didn't have any sophisticated technology to really interpret what he was hearing. So he must have tried to make sense of what he was hearing. But that is very difficult to use as evidence for the intermediate period, for the same period that Mavrochalividis, for instance, was describing for Axenitica.
Thank you very much, yes, for your answer. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
May I ask you one more small question? Tiny.
Yeah, okay, yeah, please.
Yeah, is there any internet presence of Axenitica and Mishotika? Because, well, I know that there is a lot of Epirotica and Lesbiaca, and wherever there are some dialects pretty well represented on internet. Is this the case with Cappadocian dialects?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part of your question. You were talking about the representation of the dialect on the internet, right? Yeah.
Yes.
The connection is
unstable. Okay.
Unstable. Yeah.
Sorry.
So, yeah. Well,
I'm in Athens, so that's just. Yeah.
Well, you probably know that there are websites, but there are also pages on Facebook, for instance, which are for Cappadocians coming from one particular village, and where people often ask questions, and they are very interesting. For instance, they say, what is the meaning of this word? My grandmother used to use it, and I have no idea what it means. Or two words which happen to have the same pronunciation for different reasons. One is a Turkish loan word, the other one is a Greek word, which has changed over time, and as a result, they have become homophonous, etc., etc. But these are not really very good as sources for the dialect, except if you know who is the contributor. There are some contributors who are, reliable, and others who are, well, because they are semi-speakers, and that's not meant as, no offense, of course, but it's difficult to use it. It's interesting. It's in its own right, okay, because you can see how people are actually looking at their own dialect from a certain distance sometimes. But no, there are no good sources except for a couple of recordings that were made by Tede, what's his name? Tede Jensen from Vienna, who has recorded a number of dialects. So you can actually see the speakers, say something in their dialect, not just in Mishotika, but also in Pontic, Romaica, and other Greek dialects. But it's not enough. What you could look at are the recordings that Angeliki Kirali and I made together during a project we had in the 2000s, And they are, I can send you the reference to that because they are accessible if you would like to, you know, to listen to them. And Angeliki has, of course, made additional recordings which are stored at the Laboratory of Greek Dialect, Mono-Greek Dialects in Patras. Okay, and these are resources that you should really check out if you want to know more about the dialects. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much today, and I'm just really sorry I won't be able to come tomorrow as well for another minute, but it was a great talk.
Thank you.
So my understanding, the main differences between the dialects are phonological and some occasional borrowings that one dialect does do, the other doesn't. And from this mini corpus that you've given us, really, in terms of word order and syntax, they're really identical.
Yeah.
And not only are they identical, they withstood the contact with modern Greek.
Yeah.
And the different, possibly different contact, different forms of Greek that they withstood. So is this the conclusion correct? I mean, is it
Yes.
indeed the case that
Yes.
grammatically we see something very similar and quite
Yeah.
robust and
As I said, the main differences are in the phonology. Okay, but if you look at the inflection, for instance, or the morphology, you see the similarities. Okay, if you look at word order is very sensitive to contact, as you can imagine. So in Turkish, you have prenominal modifiers, so adjectives, genitives, they precede the noun instead of following them. You can do this to a certain extent in Greek, but if you have like the son of my father's second wife, that will become very difficult to have all the genitives precede the noun in Greek, and you could do it easily in Cappadocian, but a modern speaker quite naturally follows the Greek word order. This is perhaps most visible or audible if they use a relative clause. So in Cappadocian, you would say to rancha to korich, the girl that I saw. To is the relative, rancha the verb. I saw so the head noun is actually following at the end. They don't use it, so they would use the Greek word order, and even this phenomenon of using what looks like the article instead of pu or something similar, which is of course an old phenomenon as well. You see that people tend to use pu instead of to or ta. So in the word order, there is more interference. In this particular text, I have to admit, I made them up. And I noticed this when it's very difficult for me to speak it fluently. But if I have time, or when I have time, I can think about it, and then I can reconstruct the older form of Cappadocian, which is why I sometimes use these forms when I say Katalaves. And I say Anglaicha, Katalava, it means Katalava, but then using the Cappadocian word, I think that my Cappadocian is not a realistic form anymore. And sometimes one of my best informants, he speaks it very well. He's very, very dedicated to the preservation of Mishotica, but he is a Turkologist. So you can imagine that in his version of Mishotica, all the Turkish vowels are still in place. And we have done a lot of research on the survival of the Turkish vowels, the and the and the u. They are almost lost everywhere and replaced with u or I. Düşünmek, düşündüzo becomes düşündizo or düşündizo. I mean, all kinds of variations. But when he speaks it, of course, all the u's and u's are still there. And that may be a kind of Mishotica that is hypercorrect as well. But still, it's nice to try to be correct every now and then. Thank you.
I think we have completed this very interesting discussion now, and I'd like to the second speaker for his and thank you, all of you who are online too. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yes.